Hope everybody is staying warm in this lovely cold spurt we're having. Today we're going to go through and talk about OnBase Studio because as of 14, you will be using OnBase Studio to do all of your workflow and workview configuration. So we're going to give you a tour of it today, and hopefully it will answer any questions you have.
Should be a good overview, get you guys started on it if you've never used it before.
Here's a picture of our group. Me, Jennifer, I'm going to just give you a little overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andy, and he is going to do a demo for you today that's going to go through a whole lot of pieces within the studio.
We're going to be mostly demo this morning. I've got Gabe here as well. He's our ranking FNG here in the customer care group. Hi, Gabe.
Hey, everyone.
As usual, the audience is muted. We have a chat box available, as well as the questions panel for asking questions during the show, or during the webinar. We have a survey that we'll send out at the end of the webinar. If you guys can fill that out, that would be excellent. And you can always get our previous webinars on our website at navient-inc.com/resources/video. So without further ado, what are we going to be looking at today? We will be looking at a kickstart onto the OnBase Studio. To get you guys up and running, if you've never used Studio before, I'll show you the highlight features and how to get around OnBase Studio. We'll start with installing Studio and getting connected, and then I'll go over the interface, the unique interface that Studio uses. It's very similar to the client if you're used to using that, or the more modern Office Suites 2007, 2010, 2013. We'll go over finding what you need in the workflow in OnBase Studio, including using the search function, as well as type ahead find, workflow doctor for finding issues in your workflow, and I'll go over a few keyboard shortcuts to speed things up. Finally, we're going to get to, in the middle of our segment, we'll get to importing and exporting workflow. I've got a little workflow. If any of you attended Guy's presentation at our user summit, you'll recognize the workflow we're going to import today. I'll show you how to import it, how to resolve the issues on a workflow import. It's not really that daunting. I'll walk you through exactly how to do that and the methodologies needed. We'll take a look at a couple of new features in 14, in Studio version 14. Workflow compare tool is a really powerful way to compare workflows. We'll actually generate a working copy and a test copy of that workflow that we import, and then compare the two. Of course, they'll be the same, at least I hope they will. And then I'll really briefly go over the test item generator, which is a great way of testing your newly developed workflow in 14. Finally, we want to touch on the automatic documentation features in OnBase Studio. You can add documentation to every workflow object in OnBase Studio. It's saved in the database, and then you can pull that documentation back out. I mean, you can see it while it's there. If you're working on the workflow and you're like, what does this queue do? You can use the documentation tab to see what it does. But you can pull that documentation out into automatically generated admin and user guides, and I'll show you how to build those. And then I'll also really briefly touch on how to build your own custom documentation, because you can change what documentation Studio generates. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the live demo. Nothing like doing it live. Everybody updates here. There we go. All right, I'm going to jump into my VM here. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is install Studio. If I know a lot of you probably don't have it installed. If you don't, it's pretty easy. You can grab the installer from us. We can send it to you for the appropriate version. If you're in OnBase versions 12, 13, or 14, you can get access to Studio. In 12, it's called Workflow Studio, and 13 and 14, it's OnBase Studio. Installation is really simple. There aren't any configuration options in installation. Basically, just tell it where you want the install path to be, and the rest is butter. There we go. There's nothing to it. There's no paths to enter. There's no app server URL to memorize. No ODBC connections to set up during install. And that is because these options are set when you launch Studio. And I'll show you exactly how that's done in just a moment here. Step 2 is getting connected. In OnBase 14 Studio, there are 2 ways of connecting to what Studio calls your repository, which is your workflow layout that you have in your database. The first way is the classic way of doing it. The way you'll do it in 12 and 13 is using an app server. That's pretty easy. You just have to know the URL for your app server. It's the same URL you'd use if you're configuring your web server or if you're setting up a Unity client, which is usually your app server address /app server /service.asmx. Pretty standard. Then you'll have to know the data source on that app server. Again, pretty normal. You can log in using standard OnBase authentication or NT authentication if you have it configured in your environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the 14 method. 14 allows you to use a local ODBC connection, just like classic OnBase config. In this case, we need the data source is the local ODBC connection, which happens to be the same on this machine. And we're just going to do standard authentication. You can, again, use NT authentication if you guys are using single sign-on. So we'll log in and get started. Actually, I have my password. I bet I don't have no ODBC set on this. Darn it. Nothing like a live demo. So we'll go through the app server. It's fine. I've got an app server on here.
If you already have app server set up, there's no reason not to use that. It's just another option that's available to you in 14.
Correct.
The one is good, the other is bad. It's more because this is replacing that configuration option. If you don't have an app server set up, you can still go through and use Studio.
Correct. That's absolutely correct, Steve. Looks like got IP issue here. Oh yeah, we were having network issues this morning. Like a live demo, folks. One quick sec here. So let's go over some of the points we're going to touch on today. For example, so the ribbon interface that we're going to go over next is quite a bit different from what you're used to seeing in classic OnBase config. It's much closer to what you'd see in Unity. We haven't restarted yet.
Or Outlook integration if you have that.
Yeah, it's much closer to the interface you'll see in your Outlook integration or Unity clients. Get this going here.
And it does take a little bit to get used to, so it's a good, I mean, if you're thinking about going to 14 in the future and you're running 12 or 13, it's a good time to get it and at least get started on it. So you'll feel a little bit more comfortable when you go to 14 when that's your best or your only option for making workflow changes.
Oh, these network errors appear to have propagated to my virtual machines. That's not good. Network connections.
It's all local, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it should just go through localhost.
Sure that's the right ODBC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just double checked. Yeah, password's right. Double check my. Oh, I agree. Hyper-V is nice because it's free, but sometimes you get what you pay for. Okay. Oh, I know why. Run all the tests at my workstation connected to the hardwired Ethernet, and then try and do the presentation on Wi-Fi. Hey, you have network issues because your VM thinks Wi-Fi isn't a real thing. All right, apologies for that. Okay, so this is OnBase Studio. If you've never looked at it before, it looks a little weird because there's just a lot going on. Up on the top of the screen, you have the ribbon interface we were talking about. It's broken up into tabs. The Home tab, Workflow tab, Workview tab, and then additional tabs for whatever you're licensed for. Obviously, you don't have a Workview tab if you're not licensed for Workview. If you don't have a Workflow tab, what are you using Studio for? We're going to touch on the Home tab here first. This deals with general settings and actions that you'll be using in Studio. Connecting to a data source, you can get properties about a specific connection, lets you look at where your, if you have any like Workview system paths, Workview options set up in there. Closing the current repository, saving, probably the most important button here is saving the repository. When you make changes, you want to save it. You also have the option to reset your server cache. This does the normal recycle feature that was introduced in 12, where it sets a row in the database, app server picks it up, recycles its cache, doesn't kick anybody out of the server. That's a nice friendly restart, we all know. Then we have import and export. This is for importing and exporting workflow life cycles. We're going to touch on that in just a minute. And of course the find tool, which we'll also touch on in a minute here. You also have some additional buttons in here. If you're configuring any web services, any WSDL calls, they'll show up in here, as well as if you have any roles configured for your server. Then the Workflow tab is everything, all the actions based around workflow. So creating new workflow objects, lifecycles, queues, actions, rules, transitions, timers, etc., all in here. Then we have lifecycle actions such as checking the design view of a lifecycle. So let's say this lifecycle, we can close the start page here. All of these tabs are resizable and reconfigurable. You can move them around, resize them, close them. I like to close the start page. It's pretty much useless. So let's go to this lifecycle and click the design button. You can see the design view for that lifecycle. Not a whole lot going on in that lifecycle. Doesn't look much. The lifecycle section of this tab is where you'll find check-in and check-out for a lifecycle. In order to make any changes to a lifecycle, you have to check it out. And this prevents simultaneous modification, which was never prevented in the classic OnBase client. So if you have multiple people working on workflow at the same time, using the check-in and prevent people from stopping all over each other's changes and doing real harm to your workflow installation. Here we'll find the Create Documentation button, Configuration Report, which is very similar to the Configuration Report in Classic Client. Let's see, we've got portfolio types for doing Workview, filters. You can configure your workflow notifications here. These are the same workflow notifications that you would do in Classic Client. They've moved to Studio in 14 along with Workflow itself. You can set up your user forms for doing user interaction. And then new in 14 is setting your window titles. You can change the window titles for your queues and life cycles. This is also where you'll find the item generator, which we'll touch on at the end of the presentation. Your Unity projects also hang out here. This is the same as doing the Unity scripts option in config. And then we won't touch on web publishing or VPMN. Alrighty, so that's the interface. Now in Classic Config, you had the option to run Workflow Doctor at any point when you wanted to. In Studio, Workflow Doctor runs all the time and keeps an eye on your system, make sure everything is okay. And the Doctor results hang out at the bottom of the screen. In a default install, it will be pinned to the bottom of the screen like this. Again, all of these windows are movable, resizable, and dockable. We can put this here. I like to just hide it until I need it. So we'll go to the dock. So all of these are movable and resizable. So let's try and find something. Let's do a search. Search is pretty standard. It works pretty similarly to workflow search in config. It's a little easier to understand though. The layout is just a little better. So you can search for specific objects, workflow, workview objects. Because they're unified in 14, you can search for both in here, which is really nice. Anybody who works with workview a lot, it's really fantastic to be able to search for that. So let's look for, what should we look for? Let's find any actions that include the word set. Now we can reset, set status to, we find all of these things in here. And if we, apparently not, if we double click there, it works in Doctor. All right. So we can find things we want. So let's say anything that works with keywords, any actions that work on keywords. So clearing note text keywords, setting keywords, incrementing keywords. Find is pretty normal. A new feature in 14 is find dependency. So you can look for, say, a document type. So let's see what we want to find out what things depend on the aging report document type. So we'll go find. And they'll tell us that there's nothing that depends on the AR document, or AR aging report document type. There's nothing in Workflow that uses it. Let's try the customer PO. Packing slips, I know. So packing slips. There's one rule that checks to see if there's a packing slip for an invoice, for an AP invoice. So just trying to find that normally without find dependency would be a huge pain in the butt. Here's really a piece of cake. All right. We've got a lot to cover, so we're going to move on pretty quickly. So, Workflow Doctor, the next part of finding what you need. Workflow Doctor, like I said, is running all the time, keeping an eye on your workflow. The results end up at the bottom of the screen, and the Doctor Results tab. And let's say, so we've got 10 errors here. Looks like legal is doing some bad things. So, property name is not configured. You could, try and find this particular rule or action that's doing this, that's not configured, by expanding the legal, legal contract request processing. We try and expand contract request processing, see if we can find it in here somewhere in there. Instead, a nice feature in Doctor, so you double click, it'll take you directly to the thing you're looking for. There it is. So this property name is not configured. So we can check this out and then change the property name, save it, and we'd be good to go. Doctor's really handy that way. Let's see what else. Keyboard shortcuts. All right, so maybe you're trying to troubleshoot a workflow and you're not sure why it's doing something. You can go through and click these little tiny disclosure triangles to expand the workflow down and take a look at what's in there. But if you have a really complex workflow, I think that legal one was pretty good. Yeah, it can be a pain. Well, what's in here? Well, let's expand the system work. Well, there's a rule here. Okay, so false. It's just kind of annoying. I'll tell you, there's something going wrong with the awaiting a response life cycle. If you press Shift right arrow, you'll expand the entire tree down from this. Shift right arrow, if I can get it to keep there we go. Shift right arrow. Expands the whole tree out from wherever you're selecting. So you can look at everything. There's a system work, all expanded. You don't have to pick through it one at a time. All the timers expanded all the way through. Again, don't have to pick through it one at a time. You can move through this tree using the arrow keys as well. Up and down arrow just moves up and down. Left and right arrow will close and hide or open and show a tree. It does apparently move your focus though. So let's close this up with a control left arrow. And you can do that at the life cycle level as well. Control right arrow, shift right arrow. There's everything in this entire life cycle, all right there. Makes it much easier to go through and troubleshoot, try and find what you're looking for. Let's see what else. This is a ribbon interface application, so I don't know how many of you know this, but if you press the Alt key, just press it and release it, you'll notice up at the top of the ribbon you get some letters appear. Those are keyboard accelerators. If you press that letter, so let's say press W for workflow, we'll go to the workflow tab. And then all of these letters can be used for quickly getting to things. Let's say we want to create documentation. That was O. We're on the Home tab, so we do Alt, W, O. We'll get the Create Documentation wizard. So that works in anything that uses a ribbon interface. So give it a try sometime the next time you're in Outlook or in Unity Client. moving right along. What is the next thing? Importing and exporting workflow. So this is one I get questions about all the time. We like workflow, but we don't want to configure something really complicated because then we just have to go back and reconfigure it in prod once we're done testing it. No, you don't. Assuming your test and prod systems are close enough together, you can export it from your test system and import it into prod. You'll still need to make a few changes to it, but I'll show you exactly how to do that right here. So first, you connect to a repository like we are now. You don't have to check out any life cycles or anything. Just go ahead and hit the import button, and you'll get the import dialog box. So you're importing from a file. You can export to your OnBase database, or you can export to a file. You can only import from a file. So let's browse for our import file. I saved out a workflow before we started. Here we go. This is the one that you guys built at the user summit this year. So we'll pull this workflow in. If you've been working with this workflow frequently, you can set your initial resolutions. This is the configuration part we're going to go over in a minute. You can save those out, like you know these 12 things are always going to be mapped to the same name or something. You can save those out to a file if you're working with this workflow consistently. Or say this is the 5th or 6th revision to this workflow that you've made. You can keep your original revisions or your original resolutions in a file, and then you don't have to go back through and select those again. Really helps save some time. Also, this is a test virtual machine, so I don't really care about the database on this, but if you're doing this in prod, make sure you do a full backup before you do an import. Not that the import process itself can fail. I mean, it can. It's very rare that it does, but if you're not entirely on top of things when you're importing, you can end up overwriting keywords or overwriting document types if you're not careful. Because this is an authoritative addition to your database. So once you hit next,
still a good time to get a backup.
Still a good time to get a backup. Always a good time to get a backup. There's never too many backups.
Always good to have that option if something happens.
Absolutely. So once you have backed up and you hit next, you get this is the main import screen. And this is where we set our resolutions. Workflow Studio, OnBase Studio has pulled in this file and taken a look at it and compared it to what's in your database now. And it says, hey, these things in red here are different. What do you want to do with them? And you can go through and you can go through individually life cycles and add them. We're just going to take the top level. If we hit resolve, this would show us if we're importing multiple life cycles, which you can do. You can import and export multiple life cycles at once. It would show us all the life cycles we're importing. So here's our life cycle, the nav document review life cycle. And right now, our import action is set to none. Nothing's going to happen. It won't import it. And we don't have a nav document review lifecycle in here, as you can see. That doesn't exist. We're importing it new. So we'll use the create new function. You notice the import action changes to create new. Right? So the document types and things that are in this lifecycle need to go on your disk groups. You need to specify your disk group. This is almost always going to be different from what you have in test or dev versus prod. So you just pick the correct disk group that you're using. In this case, it's data, and hit map. And we get into the interesting stuff. So document type groups, document types. So if you use multiple document types in the lifecycle, they'll all be brought over with the export. So when you import them, they'll all show up here. In this case, we have one document type we're using in this lifecycle. If some of these document types already exist in your prod system, you can use a function called map to same name down here, which we'll do in a minute for keywords. I'll show you how that works. In this case, the nav documentation document type does exist. We can hit map to same name because I've done this a couple of times now. So I have the nav documentation doc type already. Map to same name maps it to the same thing. This is where things can get a little weird. If you have, if you have a fairly generic document type name like receipts, in your test system, and then you also have a receipt document type in your prod system, but it actually contains different documents, different kind of documents with different keywords. If you use map the same name, you can get some unexpected results. And this is where that database backup comes in handy. So I'm going to go through keyword types. I'm going to show you a really quick way to do this. Once we go through keyword types, I only have the one keyword, darn. That's the same name, I've already got it. Okay, so here's the fun part. If you already have these things, like you just made some changes to your workflow structure, you didn't change what document types it works on, you didn't really change any of your keyword types, maybe you added a keyword or two, you can do auto-resolve. The big friendly button here called auto-resolve. It does exactly what it says on the button. It'll go through and try and map to the same name any object that it finds in the import file. And if it can't find the object in your production database or whatever database you're importing into, it will create a new one. So we'll go ahead and do auto-resolve. And now you notice everything has gone from red to black. They're all resolved. We can take a look at what it did. So like the fonts, it mapped the note font to the note font, which makes sense. My user groups didn't change, so it mapped all of my user groups to the right user groups. All right, so once you have your issues resolved, your resolution set, you can hit next. But this is where you can save your resolutions. If you're working with this workflow frequently, you can save these resolutions out to a file and then load them in later when your workflow changes. That way, you only have to change the mappings or create new resolutions for the new items that you're working with in the workflow. So we'll hit next. It gives us a summary of what we're importing, what file name we're importing from, what this group we're going to, keyword types. This will bring in autofill keyword sets, external autofills, keyword data sets, cascading data sets. It's a very powerful import function. So we'll go ahead and hit finish, and it does the import. And there it is. You notice right in here, there's my new lifecycle. That's it. That's importing a lifecycle in 20 seconds. All right, so we've got that lifecycle imported. Let's see what it's like to export a lifecycle. It's actually easier. So let's export the same one, just for completeness sake. You can pick what life cycles you want to export on the list on the left. You can also export other things, folder types, document types. This is a great way to get a doc type out of your file system or out of your test system into production to double check something. Unity forms are a great example. This is a great way to get a Unity form out of a test system or out of a production system for testing if it's doing strange things. So we're going to export a lifecycle. We're going to export the nav lifecycle we just built, we just imported. Go ahead and hit next. So here's your options to archive it into OnBase or save it as a local file. We're going to save it as a local file. We'll accept the default. It's going to put it in my documents folder with the current date and time. And there it is. Really easy. Import and export is not that scary. I mean, things can go wrong, but it's not that scary. If you're patient and you run through your entire config, you'll be fine. You'll be just fine. All right, so that is importing and exporting. All right, compare. Workflow compare. This is a new feature in 14. You can compare two life cycles. So what we're going to do first is, let's compare it. So you right-click on your life cycle and hit compare to. You'll be presented with a list of the other life cycles in your system. You can compare these. You can compare a life cycle between, if you have two versions, if you have a working and a test version in the same system, You can compare differences. These are going to be pretty different. So I'm going to compare nav document review with the legal contract request processing lifecycle. It's going to be pretty different, but we'll see. All right, so once you start to compare, you get the compare interface, and it shows you in a nice color and spatial coded manner what things are different between the two life cycles. In this case, hopefully everything is different between these two life cycles because they're entirely different life cycles. And it looks like they are. Everything is completely different. But you can see where the value would be if you have, if you're using the working copy, test copy, lifecycle features in 14, where you can use this workflow compare to see how different things are between two life cycles. So if you're building a lifecycle in test, you can import it into prod as a working copy, or as a test copy, as a non-working copy, and then compare it to production and make sure that you've made all the changes you need to make. You know, so you can, if you say you're going to make these 8 changes to this workflow lifecycle to meet business requirements, you can use compare to tell you whether you've made that or not. Right, so workflow compare, test item generation. How are we doing on time? We are getting tight. So let's do some document generation real quick here. So this is in the workflow tab up at the top. Switch over to the workflow tab. And it's under this item generation section. Item generation is a new feature in 14. It lets you really quickly generate test documents and large numbers of test documents to allow you to test a workflow. The nice part is you can put documents anywhere in a workflow that you want. You can set keywords to anything you want them to be. We'll do a real quick one here. This is a simple lifecycle. It's got a document type with just one keyword type on it. So we'll call this our test generator. We're going to generate documents. You can generate Unity forms as well. Documents, you can generate image documents, text documents, or e-forms. So let's generate the document that we're working with. You can generate any document you'd like. Let's generate 20 of them. A document will contain the following text. This is a test document, exclamation point. And there's only one keyword on the document type, which is status. We're going to set this to known, which is actually not a value you can get through the workflow. So it'll be interesting to see what it does with that. So you can set whether you want them to, just exist in the system, have them added to the workflow that's associated with them as normal, like you would during normal document import, or you can have them added to a specific lifecycle and a specific queue in that lifecycle. So we'll have it add itself to the queue it's supposed to be in. We'll have it do the system work. All right, and we'll run it. So we've got our test generator. We'll execute it. All right, we'll save repository first. It's a good idea. Save early, save often. Okay, so our items have been generated, and we can see them in the Unity client. Pull up the Unity client here real quick. There we go. Switch over to the workflow view here. So we have our nav document review queue. Hey, look at that. There's 20 things in user review. Let's say this is a test document. That's really basically, really quickly how item generators work. Because you can add them to any part of a lifecycle and then have the system work executed. In this case, it did execute the queue initial just moves it to the user review queue, and they're all sitting in user review, so all the system work worked just fine. It's a really easy way to test a workflow. You can develop some really complicated tests with it too. And the nice part, the really nice part, is when you're done testing, you can go through, here's the batch we generated, we can just remove the entire batch of test documents. Take them all out, all at once. That was probably the best part of that feature. Trying to generate test documents and then having them sit around in the system because they're too much of a pain to delete. All that pain has been removed with the test object generator in 14. All right, and for our last 10 or 15 minutes, let's go over automatic documentation. This is a feature we've been trying to push recently because we think it's really great. In Studio, I don't know if you notice over here on the right where your Properties tab is, you have the normal things you're used to seeing in config, your user group configuration, your general settings, what document types are assigned to the queue. In this case, because this is a lifecycle, what document types are assigned to the lifecycle. Your icon settings. There's another tab here called Documentation. And within the Documentation tab, you can add explanation for what specific queues are doing, specific queues and actions are doing. And these are saved and loaded on import and export. So let's say, well, let's see, what does the user review queue do? Let's look at the documentation. Allows users to review the nav documents. Details, users can process the document if it meets criteria. So this is where you would put in your what this particular queue does, why it's here, what business need it solves. And you can add documentation to pretty much any object in here. You see the documentation tab appears on pretty much everything. So here we have an ad hoc task. We have some documentation in here. It's terrific. Transitions, timers. I don't have any timers in this queue, but you get the idea. The documentation is really handy.
It's a really good feature for other people to know. So if you have somebody creating workflows and you may have somebody that backs that person up but isn't in there every day, and of course they're gone for 2 weeks on a tropical vacation to get out of the cold, and something happens to your workflow, this documentation can be very helpful to help them understand a little better what that workflow is doing and what each step in the process, what actions and stuff is behind it. So
absolutely, and it's centrally located. It's saved within the database with OnBase. So it gets backed up when you back up your OnBase database. It's always there. You don't have to deal with it sitting on a file share somewhere, keeping it up to date. If you make changes to your workflow, you can just change the documentation right in there at the same time. Makes it a lot easier to keep it up to date. So one of the cool things that Highland decided to do with this documentation, with this built-in documentation, is not just bury it in this documentation tab, but you can also pull it out into an actual user guide. You can build your own user guides and admin guides that will not only, it's like a configuration report, it will tell you how a queue is configured, how a lifecycle is configured, the user groups, what document types are in there, but then it will also pull those documentation text fields out into your user guide, and it'll save it out as a Word doc. You can put that on a SharePoint site, to assist your new users of workflow. Like, hey, by the way, if you get stuck using this, the user guide is right here, and you can just generate that straight out of OnBase Studio. So let's build an example user guide here. So what we do is Workflow tab, up here, Workflow tab, create documentation, the user guide. I'm going to use it on this life cycle. You can document as many life cycles as you want and just add them to the list.
And the difference between the user guide and the admin guide is the user guide is the default, less detailed version, whereas the admin guide is going to pull in more information there.
Correct. Thank you, Kate. That's documentation. As a default save location, again, it goes into my documents folder. Just calls itself user guide. That's fine.
It's displayed.
Sure. You don't have to go find it. So it builds it really quickly and then pulls it up. And this is what the documentation looks like by default. This is just the default template. So we had table of contents, we don't have one. Gives you a basic overview of what OnBase is, what the client does, how OnBase Workflow works, what queues, transitions, lifecycles mean. It's got a great glossary of terms. And then we go through and we can see the actual lifecycle that we exported and all of its configuration points. We've got the, if you build a configuration image in design view, it shows up here. It'll go through the queues and the ad hoc tasks. If there's any documentation in there, it'll pull those out into this user guide. And it's all automatic. Click a button and it's generated. It's really handy. It includes all of your icons you've selected for your queues and your ad hoc tasks. Very cool. There's one big feature, though, that we really like, and that is the ability to customize this. It is completely customizable. It uses similar technology to the document composition subsystem. To customize it, it takes you have to walk around your file system a little bit. If you go to where OnBase Studio is installed, so by default, that'll be in the program files folder. Go to your OnBase Studio icon, open a file location. It's a little messy to get here, but here's your document templates folder. That's where your documentation lives. Looks familiar, right? Admin guide and user guide. So what you can do is you can copy these out and then edit them yourself. It's just a Word doc with some template stuff, some doc comp templates and fragments in there. You can customize it any way you want. So for example, I did a quick one the other day where I changed the style of it. Because it's a Word doc, it obeys Word's styles and formatting. So I changed mine to this style, elegant, I think they called it. I don't know. It's red. Red makes it go faster. So let's see if it works. All you have to do, as you can see in here, I've got my template info, which you have to highlight. It says you have to edit to change your documentation name. That's the name that shows up in OnBase Studio. You can change a bunch of other things. You can change the default path where it saves. And here, I just kept it as the default. It's fine.
Yeah, it also defines the other pieces that are used. So those other templates and or document template and document fragments. It says which ones of those are used for this guide.
Exactly. So where's my document? Where are my fragments? All right. So I've already gone through and done this. Let's put it into Studio. We have our document templates folder open here. Just drag it in. And then go back into Studio. Hit Create Documentation. Hey, look at that. Custom documentation. Looks like it works. We'll call this Guide 2. Yeah, look at that. And there's our red style. Now in this one, I actually ended up editing this from the admin guide, so there's a lot more additional configuration information in here, where queues transition to and from, other configuration information, user groups that are allowed to use it, stuff like that. And you can use whatever fragments you want. You can go through and edit them using the normal template builder tools that you have available in .conf, if any of you have used .conf. That is generating documentation. And it just pulls all that stuff from the documentation tabs that you've edited in Studio itself. All right, looks like we are just about done. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I think the one other thing about the documentation is if you want to see which elements are available,
yes.
just go. This is going to take less than a minute here to show this. Under Create Documentation, it says Documentation Tags there in the bottom right. That's actually a hyperlink where you can click on it and that will show you the different elements that are available. So when you're building out a template, if you decide to do that, these are the different tags you can add to those fragments. So you see right now Andy has the document fragment up there. You can drill down into all the different other ones there. So there's going to be life cycle, there's going to be queue, there's going to be transition, etc. Yep. So these are all the different pieces that are available. And then when the template is built, it'll pull the documentation from any one of those where you've added documentation.
Yep.
So that's just another degree of customization that's available to you.
Absolutely. And that is outlined a bit in the MRG, in the Studio MRG, and then there's a really great post on communities for that.
Yep.
I don't think I have the hyperlink on me, conveniently, unfortunately. All right, so hop out of the VM here, and back into presentation. So that is it for our real quick kickstart into OnBase Studio.
Yep, and just like all of our information that we have here, if you have any other questions, you can feel free to contact us. There's a lot about it on the community site for Highland. You know, since it is, I mean, your only way to edit workflow in 14, there's a lot of good information out there. And there's always our blog that always has a lot of good information on it too.
There's a nice juicy MRG with over 900 pages too if you really feel like getting into it.
Oh yeah. Good stuff.
A lot of information.
All right, so have any questions? Let's see. We have, doesn't look like it. Anybody have any questions about Studio?
All right, well, like I said again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at support@navient-inc.com, and we will help you out.
Absolutely. All right, so current versions, of course. We're on OnBase 14 now. Current version is 14.0061. Teleforms is up to 10.8. I think they released that in July.
Yep, and Colfax hasn't had much changes as of late. So
I haven't. All right.
And here's our support information, which is the standard. It hasn't changed. So please feel free to contact us in any of the ways that you prefer.
Absolutely.
And then our next webinar will be in January. And we have not come up with a topic yet, so here's a great time for you, opportunity to fill out the survey at the end and tell us what you want to hear about, and we can adopt that into our next webinar.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, our Navient conference, which will be October of 2015, and this year it's going to be at Lambeau Field in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So we're very excited about that. It should be a great event.
All right. I'll do one more check here for questions. That looks like that's it. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we will have all of you back in January for our next one.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Then.
Have a good day.